Hi, my name's Phil. I'm talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the political fallout over Boris Johnson's COVID visit to Scotland, which the SNP have attacked as undermining his message of staying home, and Johnson partially used to talk about Scottish independence whilst also saying that others shouldn't talk about Scottish independence. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, first things first, whilst we're on about Boris Johnson and the pandemic, I might as well throw in a few thoughts about the rights and wrongs of his visit to Scotland this week. Now, I've already said that I feel it does undermine that message of stay at home where you can, but it's a bit nuanced. I think I want to go over that because, you know, flying to the other end of the country, you could argue, well, he's not really necessary, Prime Minister. And I'm still of the view that he's undermined it, but not just because he's gone somewhere else. There are valid counter views as well. It's not the same as saying, oh, well, I'm not allowed to visit my sister, but you can go all the way to Scotland. The first thing is that the Prime Minister does have a role in touring the country, visiting places around the country. And you can't do it as you would have done before the pandemic, but it is possible to manage it safely if the need arises. I mean, does that mean that our Prime Minister and his staff will conduct themselves in a COVID secure way? You would like to think so. They certainly didn't at the start of the emergency. If you recall, you had Boris Johnson boasting about shaking hands with COVID patients. You had numerous ministers, including himself, as well as senior officials, who were becoming infected with COVID because they obviously weren't maintaining social distancing, and they certainly weren't wearing face masks. But it is possible that lessons have been learned. And the other thing to note is, so the SNP, for example, are attacking Boris Johnson for undermining the stay-at-home message, just as I have. However, you also have to think about, so let's say he just confined himself to Downing Street then. You just said, look, you know, Prime Minister, you can do your work from Downing Street, just stay there. Well, then the SNP and others as well would then accuse him of, you know, staying in his ivory tower, never actually seeing the places that his policies are affecting. Oh, he's just, you know, staying in London, just doing things for them. Not that he's done anything really for London. I mean, that's politics. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't. On balance, I could actually almost support Johnson's visit. Under other circumstances, I absolutely would. And I'd be saying that anyone criticising him for it is just plain politics. It was supposed to be a visit to a vaccination centre, raising awareness. We need to vaccinate as many people as possible. When people get their appointments to be vaccinated, I know there's some people have been given appointments 100 bloody miles away, but where you are given an appointment, if you've got people just choosing not to go to it, that needs to be nipped in the bud. It's quite a serious situation. It's believed we realistically need to vaccinate about 90% of the population. I mean, I'm not sure I'm seeing that, but you need to get as much as possible. So, yes, the idea that the Prime Minister, and it's no good just visiting a hospital in London, because again, well, how's that going to be seen? Oh, it's all right, you go into London, that's not connecting with the people in Scotland, is it, or other parts of the country? So, you know, I could back that up. And as I say, being Prime Minister, visits like that, you can't do the amount of touring you do ordinarily, but for something specific like that, I can get on board with that. As long as, of course, you've got some enhanced risk assessments, you know, taking into account the pandemic. But the reason for me why I say that on balance it's undermining the message is because Boris Johnson has continually refused to follow the rules himself, rules that he sets for others. He's somehow immune. And I don't think this is one example, but it could be seen as another example. He's also refused to take to task those close to him or even just on the same side as him who also break those rules. You know, it's literally the case, if a Labour MP were to behave in a certain way, he'd attack it. But if a Conservative MP were to do exactly the same, he would defend it, particularly if it's one of his ministers. And it's that hypocrisy, which also exists in politics. I'm not saying the Conservatives have got a monopoly on hypocrisy. But it is that level of hypocrisy that's really in your face when it's the government that causes it to undermine the message, because it looks like another case of one rule for you and no rules for me. You're not allowed to even go down the end of your street to visit a neighbour, but I can fly all the way across the country to visit a vaccination centre. But you know, that being said, it's not the most serious way he's undermining his COVID message. For that, you've got Desmond Swayne. So for those who don't know, one of the particularly cretinous and flamboyant Tory MPs who has been defending those breaking the rules, basically COVID restriction rules. He's been defending them. He's been, in fact, more than that, he's been encouraging them. Now, this is pretty appalling, and people have said that he should have the whip removed, because it's not just that. So Desmond Swayne will have a certain amount of influence in his local area, I suppose. He could also be a rallying point, because it's an MP saying to these people, a lawmaker, a legislator saying to these people that they don't have to follow the rules, which is bad in any case. But there have been calls that he should have the party whip withdrawn, that Boris Johnson should make a stance and say, no, this is wrong. He has, after all, attacked others. Again, this is that hypocrisy. You know, if there were others in the media attacking the restrictions, then he's absolutely criticised them. But when one of his own MPs does, nothing. So I think actually, of anything that's undermining the message, that is the big thing for me. But in terms of the visit, I just think on balance, because of that one rule for us, another rule for them, it is undermining. I think that although there's a benefit in raising awareness, I think the net is a negative. But it's not so serious that I'm going to bang on about. I've already banged on about it far too long, haven't I? There are decent arguments for and against at the end of the day. But what was really interesting and baffling at the same time was he didn't just go there to raise awareness of the vaccination programme. Should have done. Should have confined himself to that. Bafflingly, he also seemed to go to talk about Scottish independence, ensuring that it now comes a little more likely, because every time he opens his mouth, he's a gift to the SNP. He's an absolute gift to them. You know, he implied that the SNP should stop talking endlessly about a new referendum. Now, this was odd for a couple of reasons. So first of all, you know, and I know people can say, and I'm not going to disparage this, I don't share it, but I can understand it. People saying, look, we've got this serious emergency at the moment. We should put off things like an independence referendum until we're out of this emergency. But then you pull that back on Boris Johnson. You say, well, hang on a minute. We also had a serious emergency last year, in case you hadn't noticed, a coronavirus pandemic. And we said to you, can you put off Brexit until after that? You know, extend the transition period. And he refused. So I cannot get on board with the rank hypocrisy of saying that we should have forged ahead with Brexit, as indeed we did, COVID or no COVID. But all of a sudden, we shouldn't talk about Scottish independence. No. And the other thing to bear in mind, well, another thing. So the SNP exists for one purpose, to separate Scotland from the rest of the UK. I mean, that's it. That's its raison d'etre. And the only democratic route to such an outcome is with a referendum. So, I mean, by saying that they shouldn't keep going on about a referendum, he's saying one of two things. So either he's saying that they should seek a less democratic way to leave. Is that what he's saying? I can't imagine that's what he means. Or is he suggesting that they drop their one defining policy? I mean, that would be like asking the Conservatives to stop stealing from the country and blighting the lives of future generations every time they come to power. It's not reasonable. And the final reason is I found it a little odd because he's the one who keeps bringing it up. Yeah, the SNP bring it up a lot as well. Of course they do. They're always talking about a new referendum. Yes. You know, they'd like one with all haste. Certainly before their trump card Boris Johnson is out of the picture. Could you imagine where they'd be without him? But Johnson himself seems to bring up the subject an awful lot for someone who wishes that others would stop talking about it. And then he did what he always does where Scotland is concerned. He came up with better reasons than the SNP have ever come up with for breaking away. He described the various strands of his pandemic response, including the vaccines programme and the furlough scheme, as proof that the UK works. Now, this was very poor ground to cover. You could easily paraphrase what Johnson had said as an independent Scotland could never have had the pandemic response that it did as part of the UK. Oh dear. I mean, that's not a quote, of course, but that's paraphrasing what he said. Now, that pandemic response has meant the worst death toll in Europe and one of the worst rates in the world. You're not selling the union there, Boris. Now, the response from all administrations within the UK has not exactly been brilliant, I'm going to have to say here. Stark contrast between how it's gone down in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of Ireland. Taken globally, Scotland has done poorly, made poor decisions. But thanks to Boris Johnson and his insular Tory media, people don't really compare themselves with people abroad. They compare themselves with other parts of the UK, especially if you are minded to be thinking about the subject of Scotland's place in the Union. You're not going to compare yourself with France and Italy or South Korea, Japan, New Zealand. You compare yourself with the rest of the UK, don't you? And when you do that comparison, Scotland have done rather better than south of the border. Let us face facts. You know, for a start, although they've got some things wrong, and they've got some things wrong that Johnson got wrong as well and shouldn't have done, they haven't been raiding the coffers. They haven't been giving out dodgy contracts, as far as I can tell, at any rate. Certainly not to the same extent. The fact of the matter is that Boris Johnson has messed up everything so far. Scotland may have done poorly, may have made bad mistakes for various reasons, but it's done better than England, say, in terms of, in terms of support. There's also the economic support that Johnson's government refused to provide as well. So again, I don't know why you wanted to talk about the furlough scheme. Then there was the situation, can you remember the situation with the second lockdown or just before it? So the SNP were calling on a weekly basis for the furlough scheme to be extended, as were other opposition parties, but we'll concern ourselves with the SNP and the Conservatives here. Calling for the furlough to be extended to save jobs. Johnson refused. Load of jobs were lost. Then he had to place England in lockdown, at which point he then did extend the furlough scheme, and he said that Scotland could have it for their restrictions as well. Now, this wasn't a case of only doing the right thing to help England and ignoring Scotland, because the fact of the matter is that the north of England were already effectively in lockdown anyway, and they weren't getting that support either. This was about Tory heartlands in the south of England. But the fact of the matter was, Boris Johnson refused to extend economic support for people in Scotland, and then changed his mind when the same support was needed for at least part of England. This is why Boris Johnson is an absolute gift for the SNP. It's why all of Johnson's advisors should be, and I expect are, cautioning him against ever saying anything about Scottish independence. He would do the union more favours by never uttering a word on it. Because there is strength in union. If we'd used our economic might, for example, that he keeps banging on about, to have procured the PPE we needed when we knew we needed it, instead of delaying and giving it to mates, dodgy mates, drinking buddies. If we'd never have abandoned our test and trace programme, if we'd have spent the first few months refining the furlough scheme, I could understand it initially, it just had to be out there and it wasn't all that well targeted. But if they'd have used the time to think, right, now, how do we target this so that no one falls through the cracks? If we'd have closed our borders properly, restricted entrance into the UK, we're not saying shut up shop completely. If we'd have restricted entrance, like New Zealand did, for example, if we'd have done all of those things, do you know what? We'd be sitting pretty right now. Boris Johnson, for all of his undermining the NHS over the past 10 years with, his government, could have actually come out of this with a lot of credit. We could have done a lot better than people in Europe. And in that particular case, he could have solved the union. Instead, he chose to line his pockets with the nation's wealth, and it's been a disaster. And so he's not able to. But Boris Johnson is a man who is governing by cronyism. He rewards those parts of the country who vote Conservative. This is by and large not Scotland. So they are left out immediately. His chief weapon is divide and rule. And the thing is that tactics like that do exactly what they say on the tin. They divide. So even when he wants unity, he's calling for unity in this visit. Oh, we unity, union. When you want it, you don't get it. Because you can't just distill what you want out of disunity that you are deliberately sowing from what you don't want out of it. You have to accept all the consequences. If you deliberately seek to divide the nation, it will be divided. So he has no right to complain at the SNP for pushing this defining policy. He has no right to complain about the division that he has sown. He has no moral ground to stand on when accusing anyone of playing politics. He has absolutely no right to say, oh, you shouldn't be talking about a referendum until after the pandemic's over, when he forged ahead with Brexit without waiting till after the pandemic was over. But there we go. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.